Every single day, tens of thousands of people are placed into a state that science cannot fully explain, where hours of human existence disappear into absolute nothingness without leaving a dream, a trace, or a single second of perceived time. You lie down on a cold operating table, look up at the bright ceiling lights, and hear a nurse gently ask you to count backward from 10. You reach 7, perhaps 6, and then, without any sensation of falling asleep or slipping away, you are abruptly sitting up in a recovery room miles away from where your mind last existed, while a clock on the wall insists that 4 hours have vanished. There was no darkness, no passage of time, no waiting, and no dreams. It is as though someone reached into the back of your skull, pulled a master switch, and completely erased your presence from the universe, only to click it back on hours later. Modern medicine performs this miraculous procedure over 40 million times a year, treating it as routine, predictable, and entirely safe. Yet beneath the sterile clinical confidence lies a terrifying reality that few doctors like to discuss openly. We routinely switch off human consciousness without having any clear scientific understanding of what consciousness actually is, or what exact physical mechanism we are shutting down. To truly understand how unnatural general anesthesia is, you first have to realize that it has almost nothing in common with natural sleep. When you go to sleep at night, your brain remains intensely active, cycling through complex stages of electrical activity, processing memories, regulating body temperature, and creating vivid internal realities through dreams. During deep sleep or dream states, your brain is still listening to the outside world, ready to snap you back to full awareness if your child cries out or if a sudden smoke alarm sounds in the middle of the night. Sleep is a dynamic, protective, and highly structured biological process where the observer inside your mind is simply resting in an adjacent room. Anesthesia is the total destruction of that room. Under general anesthesia, the brain's complex internal chorus falls silent. High-level electrical communication between different regions collapses, and the brain stops responding to external stimuli, pain, or danger. You cannot be woken up by a shake, a loud noise, or even a surgical incision. Functionally, a person under general anesthesia is far closer to a state of temporary brain death or a reversible coma than to anyone who is sleeping. The mind does not rest. It ceases to construct an experience of existing at all. What makes this deep biological pause so disturbing is that humanity did not invent anesthesia through a precise understanding of the brain. Instead, we stumbled upon it entirely by accident, long before modern neuroscience even existed. For thousands of years, surgery was a nightmare of blood, screams, and unimaginable agony, where speed was the surgeon's only virtue, and patients frequently died of sheer psychological and physiological shock. Then, in the mid-19th century, itinerant entertainers and dentists began experimenting with substances like ether and nitrous oxide, commonly known as laughing gas, for recreational public displays. Spectators would inhale these vapors at public shows to laugh and stumble around stage, often injuring themselves without feeling any pain. A few observant physicians noticed that people under the influence of these gases could smash their shins against wooden benches and feel absolutely nothing, prompting early pioneers like William Morton to attempt using ether vapor during surgical procedures in Boston in 1846. The demonstration was a resounding success. A patient had a tumor removed from his neck without flinching or feeling pain, changing medicine forever overnight. Yet when Morton was asked how the clear, sweet-smelling liquid accomplished this miracle, he had no answer, and neither did anyone else in the medical establishment. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since that historic day in Boston, and medical technology has advanced beyond anything 19th century doctors could have envisioned. We have mapped the human genome, built particle accelerators, sent probes beyond the solar system, and decoded the complex structural machinery of viruses. We use sophisticated modern anesthetic agents like propofol, sevoflurane, and ketamine with incredible precision, monitoring patients' heart rates, oxygen levels, and brain activity in real time. Yet if you ask a chief anesthesiologist today precisely how these chemicals extinguish subjective experience at a fundamental physical level, they will admit that we still only possess partial hypotheses and fragmented clues. We know which chemical receptors these drugs interact with, and we can track the macro-level changes in blood flow and brainwave activity. But the bridge between a chemical molecule binding to a protein receptor and the sudden, complete erasure of the conscious self remains one of the most profound, unsolved mysteries in all of science. This fundamental gap in our knowledge becomes even more eerie when you examine the drugs themselves. If you look at the chemical structures of modern anesthetics, you quickly realize that they do not belong to a single family of molecules. Propofol is a hydrophobic organic compound, ketamine is an aryl cyclohexylamine, nitrous oxide is a simple inorganic gas, and sevoflurane is a fluorinated ether. Even more bizarre is the fact that noble gases like xenon, which are completely inert chemically and do not form stable chemical bonds with anything under normal conditions, can act as potent general anesthetics when inhaled. How can a completely unreactive single atom of xenon, which refuses to engage in standard biological signaling, turn off human thought, emotion, and sensory perception? The fact that wildly different chemical structures, ranging from complex synthetic fluids to simple inert gases, can all produce the exact same total shutdown of consciousness suggests that anesthesia is not targeting a specific, single biological pathway, but is instead disrupting a fundamental physical property of life itself. For decades, the dominant theory attempting to explain this puzzle was known as the Meyer-Overton correlation, discovered at the turn of the 20th century. Researchers Hans Meyer and Charles Overton independently noticed a striking pattern. The potency of an anesthetic drug was directly proportional to its solubility in fats, specifically lipids. The more easily a substance dissolved in oil or fat, the less of it you needed to knock out an animal or a human. This led scientists to believe that anesthetics work mechanically by dissolving directly into the fatty lipid bilayer that forms the outer membrane of brain cells. The theory suggested that as these molecules flooded into the cell membranes, they caused the membranes to physically swell and become flexible, somehow jamming the delicate ion channels that allow neurons to fire electrical signals. It was a clean mechanical explanation that treated the brain like a physical machine whose gears were being clogged by fat-soluble sludge. However, as measurement tools improved in the late 20th century, the lipid theory began to show critical structural cracks. Precise biophysical experiments revealed that the physical expansion of cell membranes caused by therapeutic doses of anesthetics was far too small to disrupt protein function. It was equivalent to a tiny change in temperature of less than 1 degree Celsius, something the body experiences constantly without slipping into a coma. Furthermore, researchers discovered structural isomers, molecules that are exact mirror images of known anesthetics and have identical lipid solubility, yet have zero anesthetic effect on the brain. If lipid solubility alone were the key, both molecules should work equally well. This realization forced science to abandon the pure lipid model and admit that anesthetics must be interacting with specific, highly complex protein structures hidden deep within the architecture of our brain cells. This shift in understanding brought scientists face to face with the intricate machinery of neural receptors, particularly the gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, receptor system. GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, acting as the brain's natural brake pedal to reduce electrical excitability and prevent chaotic overstimulation. Many common anesthetics, such as propofol and barbiturates, bind directly to GABA receptors, keeping these microscopic channels open longer and flooding neurons with negatively charged chloride ions. This influx hyperpolarizes the nerve cells, making it far harder for them to fire action potentials and transmit electrical signals to their neighbors. On paper, this seems to solve the mystery. Turn up the brain's internal dampening system, and the mind quietly fades away into darkness. Yet the moment scientists tried to claim victory with the GABA explanation, deeper contradictions emerged. If simply boosting GABA activity was the sole secret to turning off consciousness, then every effective anesthetic ought to act on GABA receptors. But drugs like ketamine and nitrous oxide barely interact with GABA at all. Instead, they target NMDA receptors, which are involved in excitatory glutamate signaling, creating a state known as dissociative anesthesia, where the patient appears awake but is entirely detached from sensory input. Other effective agents act on potassium channels or sodium channels. Even more perplexing, when scientists genetically engineered mice to possess mutant GABA receptors that were completely immune to propofol, administering high doses of propofol still managed to render the mice unconscious, albeit through slightly altered neural pathways. The brain, it turned out, could be plunged into the void through multiple entirely different molecular doorways. To see just how deep this puzzle goes, you have to look beyond the human brain entirely and observe what happens when anesthetics are applied to organisms that possess no brains at all. When scientists expose sensitive plants like Mimosa pudica, which famously folds its leaves in response to being touched, to anesthetic vapors like ether or lidocaine, the plant completely loses its sensitivity. Its leaves remain fully exposed, failing to react even when poked or pinched. Venus flytraps exposed to anesthetic gases stop triggering their trap mechanism when insects walk across their delicate trigger hairs, and single-celled organisms like amoebas cease their continuous locomotive movement, freezing in place until the gas is flushed away. Even plants produce electrical action potentials that mirror animal nerve impulses, and anesthetics suppress these signals in flora just as they do in human cortical tissue. If a plant without a single neuron, synapse, or central nervous system can be anesthetized in the exact same manner as a human patient, then anesthesia is not simply turning off complex human brain networks. It is interacting with a primitive, universal physical mechanism present across all biological life. This unsettling universal effect brings us back to the human experience of the operating table and the terrifying phenomena that occur when the delicate balance of anesthesia fails. While modern monitoring equipment makes anesthesia remarkably safe, there remains a rare and haunting condition known as intraoperative awareness, or accidental awareness under general anesthesia. It is estimated to occur in roughly 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 surgical cases, representing thousands of patients every year. In these nightmare scenarios, the paralyzing agent given to keep the patient's body still during surgery works as intended. But the hypnotic drug intended to erase consciousness wears off or fails to achieve sufficient depth. The patient wakes up completely paralyzed, unable to move a muscle, open an eye, or cry out, while fully capable of feeling the sharpness of the scalpel, hearing the casual conversations of the surgical team, and experiencing absolute helpless terror inside the silent tomb of their own body. What makes intraoperative awareness so scientifically revealing is that many patients who experience it report a strange fragmentation of their mental faculties. Some regain tactile awareness without pain, others experience auditory hallucinations mixed with real room sounds, and some remember the entire horrific event vividly, while others retain no conscious memory of the trauma, exhibiting only severe, unexplained post-traumatic stress disorder weeks later. This fragmentation demonstrates that consciousness is not a single, monolithic entity that is simply turned on or off like a light bulb. Instead, what we experience as a unified, seamless mind is an intricate, highly coordinated tapestry woven from dozens of distinct functional networks spread across the brain. Anesthesia does not necessarily destroy individual thoughts or sensory processing. It destroys the brain's ability to weave those separate threads together into a single cohesive story. When neuroscientists use high-density electroencephalography and functional MRI machines to observe a brain entering anesthesia, they witness a sudden and dramatic breakdown in long-range neural communication. In a normal awake state, your brain exhibits a rich, unpredictable, and chaotic dance of electrical signals. Information flows back and forth continuously between the prefrontal cortex, the seat of higher reasoning and self-awareness, and the sensory regions at the back of the brain, routed through a central switching station called the thalamus. This constant high-speed loop of communication is known as thalamocortical connectivity. When an anesthetic drug reaches a critical concentration in the blood, this complex feedback loop suddenly collapses, replaced by slow, massive, synchronized electrical waves that sweep rhythmically across the entire cortex, or by periods of total electrical silence known as burst suppression. Neuroscientist Giulio Tononi developed a framework known as integrated information theory to explain why this shift causes consciousness to vanish. According to this theory, consciousness requires two fundamental properties: high information density and high integration. Your brain must be capable of generating a vast array of different mental states, and those states must be integrated so that all sensory inputs, memories, and thoughts are bound together into a single experience. When you look at an apple, you do not experience its red color, its smooth texture, its round shape, and its sweet smell as separate entities. You experience them simultaneously as one unified object. Under anesthesia, individual local pockets of the brain may still receive sensory signals and process basic information, but the long-range pathways that connect these pockets are severed. The information is still there in isolated pieces, but it can no longer be integrated into a single experiencing observer, causing the subjective you to instantly dissolve. Yet even this sophisticated network-level explanation leaves a gaping philosophical hole that continues to haunt neuroscientists and physicists alike. Showing that anesthesia disrupts integrated information or breaks long-range cortical loops explains what happens to the biological machinery. But it fails to explain why that physical disruption results in the complete absence of subjective inner life. This is the famous hard problem of consciousness, formulated by philosopher David Chalmers. We can easily explain how the brain processes light, translates sound waves into electrical impulses, or coordinates motor functions. But why should any of that physical processing be accompanied by an actual internal experience? Why doesn't the brain simply function like a highly complex biological computer, processing data in the dark without any inner observer experiencing it? Because anesthesia can instantly extinguish this subjective inner light using simple physical molecules, some scientists have argued that the answer must lie at an even deeper, subcellular level of reality. One of the most controversial yet persistent theories addressing this mystery was put forward by Nobel laureate mathematical physicist Sir Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, known as the orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC-OR theory. Hameroff spent decades working in operating rooms, watching patients slip into the void, and became convinced that classical neural networks alone could not account for the instantaneous, total collapse of conscious awareness. He began looking inside the individual neurons themselves, specifically at tiny, rigid protein structures that form the structural skeleton of cells, known as microtubules. Microtubules are hollow cylindrical tubes made of protein subunits called tubulin, present in vast quantities inside every living cell, especially neurons. According to the ORC-OR theory, these microtubules are not merely structural scaffolding, they act as biological quantum computers. The theory suggests that quantum coherence, a state where subatomic particles exist in multiple states simultaneously, occurs within hydrophobic pockets inside the tubulin proteins, allowing the brain to perform quantum processing that generates subjective consciousness. When an anesthetic gas or liquid enters the brain, its molecules migrate directly into these non-polar, fat-loving pockets inside the tubulin proteins, interfering with the delicate electron clouds and dampening the quantum vibrations. In essence, the theory claims that anesthetics act as quantum dampeners, destroying the delicate quantum coherence required for the mind to exist. While the ORC-OR theory is viewed with intense skepticism by many mainstream neuroscientists, who argue that the warm, wet environment of the human brain is far too chaotic to support delicate quantum states, recent laboratory experiments have begun to lend unexpected support to some of its core premises. Researchers have found that certain anesthetics do indeed alter light emission and energy transfer within microtubules, and that structural stabilizing drugs that bind to microtubules can alter the time it takes for animals to go under anesthesia. Whether consciousness is ultimately proven to be a quantum process or a purely classical network phenomenon, the fundamental paradox remains unaltered. A few drops of a clear liquid can temporarily dissolve the deeply felt sensation of human identity, reducing the grand tapestry of human emotion, history, and thought to zero. This realization brings us to a deeply personal and unsettling question that every person who has ever undergone surgery has unconsciously faced. What actually happens to you during those missing hours? When you fall asleep naturally, your brain maintains a continuous thread of identity. You remember waking up, you experience dreams, and your subconscious mind tracks the slow passage of time through circadian rhythms. You wake up feeling like the exact same person who laid down 8 hours earlier, connected by an unbroken bridge of continuous psychological time. But anesthesia creates a complete absolute breach in personal continuity, erasing the observer so thoroughly that there is no subjective sense of time having passed at all. Imagine building a teleporter that destroys your physical body on Earth, scans your atomic structure, and reconstructs an exact biological replica of you on Mars, complete with all your memories, habits, and neural connections. To an outside observer, the person who steps out of the receiver on Mars is undeniably you. But from the perspective of the individual who stepped into the machine on Earth, did they survive the trip, or were they killed, leaving a brand new copy to carry on their life with the illusion of continuity? Anesthesia presents us with a strikingly similar biological paradox. When your brain activity drops to near zero levels, long-range neural networks collapse, and your integrated information drops to baseline, the physical system generating your subjective awareness effectively stops operating. When the drug wears off and the brain slowly boots its complex operating system back up, firing its networks back into life, does the original conscious observer wake up, or does a new instance of consciousness simply inherit the brain's pre-existing memory files? This is not merely an abstract philosophical thought experiment. It is reflected in the subtle, unsettling changes that many patients report after waking from major surgery under general anesthesia. It is surprisingly common for individuals to experience persistent, subtle shifts in mood, memory, attention, and personality that can last for weeks, months, or even permanently. In medical literature, this is known as post-operative cognitive dysfunction, or POCD, particularly prevalent in elderly patients but observable across all age groups. Patients often describe feeling as though a subtle fog has settled over their inner world, or that their speed of thought and sense of personal identity feels slightly displaced, as if the brain's delicate functional wiring was reassembled slightly out of alignment when the system was brought back online. For decades, surgeons and anesthesiologists attributed these post-surgical cognitive changes entirely to the physical trauma of surgery itself. Inflammation caused by bodily incisions, slight drops in blood pressure, or microemboli traveling through the bloodstream during operation. But recent animal studies and cellular research have exposed a far more disturbing reality. The anesthetic drugs themselves can alter neural architecture. High doses or prolonged exposure to common anesthetic agents like propofol or fluorinated ethers can trigger apoptosis or programmed cell death in developing or aging neurons, disrupt tau protein phosphorylation, and alter synaptic plasticity long after the chemical has been cleared from the body's tissues. The biological pause we inflict upon the brain is not always completely clean. Sometimes the master switch leaves microscopic scars on the delicate physical canvas of memory and thought. This reality forces us to confront the true biological cost of painlessness. For centuries, human beings viewed pain as an unavoidable tax on existence, a brutal reality that made major medical intervention a terrifying last resort. By discovering how to induce a controlled, temporary suspension of consciousness, humanity achieved one of the greatest triumphs in the history of science, allowing modern medicine to perform miraculous, life-saving surgeries that would otherwise be impossible. We bought relief from agonizing physical pain by learning how to temporarily banish the conscious observer from the physical realm. But because we achieved this incredible feat through trial, error, and empirical accident rather than fundamental understanding, we remain like ancient engineers who learned how to build massive stone arches without understanding the physics of gravity. It works reliably, but we cannot fully explain why the structure stands or what hidden forces are acting upon the stones. Consider what happens inside an operating room during a complex, multi-hour brain surgery. The patient's skull is open, exposing the moist gray convolutions of the cerebral cortex, the very physical substrate that composes their life story, their love for their children, their favorite memories, their childhood fears, and their inner voice. The surgeon can physically touch the tissue responsible for language, vision, or emotion. Meanwhile, the anesthesiologist continuously titrates a microscopic stream of chemical molecules into the patient's vein, carefully keeping those neural networks suspended in a state of carefully engineered paralysis. If the dose drops slightly too low, the deep, dark ocean of the patient's mind stirs, and fragments of horrific awareness can bubble up to the surface. If the dose drifts slightly too high, the electrical activity of the brain slows down past the point of recovery, slipping from a temporary pause into permanent biological death. The anesthesiologist walks a paper-thin tightrope over an absolute abyss, maintaining a state that is neither life in the fully conscious sense nor death in the permanent sense, but a synthetic limbo that exists nowhere else in nature. What makes this synthetic limbo so profoundly haunting to consider late at night is that it reveals how terrifyingly fragile our inner reality truly is. We like to think of our thoughts, personalities, and conscious awareness as permanent, robust fires that burn continuously from the moment of our birth until our final breath. We construct elaborate philosophical systems, write literature, and build civilizations based on the assumption that our subjective mind is a solid, enduring entity. Yet the stark reality of general anesthesia proves that your entire subjective universe, every memory, every feeling, every sensation of being a person, can be completely dismantled in less than 10 seconds by a microscopic dose of simple organic chemicals. The fire does not just go dim, it is instantly and completely extinguished, leaving behind a living biological body that continues to pump blood and process oxygen while the person who inhabited it is entirely gone from existence. As neuroscientists continue to push the boundaries of brain imaging, quantum biology, and network theory, we move closer to the day when we might finally map the precise physical trigger of human consciousness. We may discover that consciousness is an emergent property of complex information loops, a quantum phenomenon residing within cellular scaffolding, or a fundamental property of the universe itself that the brain simply tunes into like a receiver. But until that breakthrough occurs, every person who steps into an operating room and counts down from 10 is taking a profound, silent leap of faith into an unexplained void. They are consenting to have their mind temporarily erased, trusting that modern medicine can successfully navigate the mysterious dark waters between life and death, and bring back the exact same observer who closed their eyes. The missing hours of anesthesia stand as a quiet, humbling monument to the limits of human knowledge, reminding us that the greatest uncharted territory in the cosmos does not lie in the deep ocean trenches or the cold reaches of interstellar space, but within the 3 pounds of tissue residing inside our own skulls. We have learned how to turn off the light of human awareness at will, but until we can explain where that light goes when it vanishes, we remain strangers to the very essence of what makes us who we are. If this unsettling glimpse into the void of human consciousness resonated with you, watch our episode on why we might never be able to peer inside the deep earth, where science hits an equally impenetrable physical wall right beneath our feet.